Today's scripture reading brings us to 2 Samuel chapter 2. I have this chapter broken down into 4 sections, and in this chapter, we're going to see a long-awaited event take place, at least in part, and that is the coronation of the king David, who was promised the throne many years earlier, anointed by Samuel, is going to finally ascend to the throne over Judah, and that's not over the entirety of the kingdom, but over part. And we see that in the first 7 verses. I have this chapter broken up into 4 sections, and the first one being verses 1 through 7, and that is titled, David Made King Over Judah in Hebron. Now, some things that you'll notice is the first thing that happens after David learns of the death of Saul and of Jonathan and 2 other brothers, the first thing David does after requiting the man who came and boasted about killing Saul is that David consults with God as to what he should do. He asks him, should I go up? And the Lord tells him to go up, and he says, okay, where? And he tells him to go into Hebron. Now, I want to say this real quick, and that is that God will give us direction when we ask it. He will give us direction. He gave David clear direction now, but he only gave David direction on what kind of the first step was, not the entirety of the walk that he would end up going in order to ascend to the throne of the entirety of the kingdom, but he gave him what he should do first. Now, listen, God will make sure and give you direction on what your next step should take, but he's not guaranteeing you the next 3 or 4 or 5 steps you should take, but he will give you direction for the next steps you take. We see that with David here. And one thing that we notice is that verse number 3, David went up and his 2 wives, Ahinoam and Abigail. Verse number 3, and his men that were with him, did David bring up, every man with his household, and they dwelt in the cities of Hebron. Reminds me of 2 Timothy 2:12. If we suffer, we shall also reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us. David's men had risked their own lives by leaving the king and going and joining forces with David. And they lived as vagabonds with David for many years. And now that David is ascending to the throne, he's bringing his men up with him. If we suffer with him, then he will promote us. We will reign with him as well. All right, so we see that in the first 7 verses. David goes up and he ascends, and then he shows grace unto those men of Jabesh Gilead, because they had risked their own lives to go and gather the bodies of Saul and of Jonathan and the other brothers that were being put on display by the Philistines in humiliation. They gathered those bodies and they brought them back, and they gave them a proper burial. And David showed them kindness and offered a hand to them that, hey, come join with me. They didn't, but he did offer that. Verses 8 through 11, I have that title that Abner makes Ishbosheth king over Israel. So David ascends to the throne of Judah, which is one of the tribes. It's a tribe in which he belonged. But now Abner, which was Saul's chief, general, right-hand man, well, and also his uncle, I believe, he takes Ishbosheth and makes him king over Israel. Now, Ishbosheth, it says here, is 40 years old. And why Ishbosheth wasn't out fighting with the other brothers, with Saul, is anyone's guess. He kind of proves to be a weak man, as you will see. Most likely, what is happening here is Abner is putting Ishbosheth as a king, but in truth, Abner's the man in charge. It ain't Ishbosheth. Abner's the man in charge, because he goes out and he gets everybody else to follow Ishbosheth. And you'll see in chapter 3, he promises David that he'll do the same for him. Abner is essentially the man in power. Ishbosheth is a figurehead, and it should remind you of our current government here in America today. But Ishbosheth makes him a puppet king, verses 8 through 11. And this, of course, is you're going to have conflict between David and his men with Joab, his chief general, and Abner and Ishbosheth, Israel. You'll see kind of a civil war that happens here because Abner was more concerned about keeping his status as second in command over the nation instead of following what he knew to be God's will, and that David would be the king of Israel. If you go back to, I think it's 1 Samuel chapter 29, 30, 28, somewhere in there, 26, when David goes into the camp and he cuts off a portion of Saul's robe. Was it? And he took a spear. I know that he did that in chapter 26. And then he goes and he begins reproving Abner. Surely Abner wasn't a big fan of David's, but he begins reproving Abner. And then at the end of that interaction, Saul admits his sin and knows that David's going to be a great leader. Abner knew that David was God's will. It was God's will for David to be king over Israel, but instead Abner was concerned about his own power. So he makes Ishbosheth king over Israel. Verses 12 through 17, that was there. Verses 12 through 17, I have that as Abner and Joab's men play. And I have that in quotation marks because, so Abner and his men, the warriors for Israel, and Joab, who is David's chief general, and also his nephew, and we'll get to that in a second. And his men come, and Abner says, well, let's have a little war games going on. And you send 12 men out, I'll send 12 men out, and they do. And those 24 men get together and they kill each other. All 24 men fall. You can see that in verse number 16 there. They fell down together. Every one of them grabbed his fellow by the head, and they stabbed each other, and this sparked a fight. And in this fight, we're going to see, which brings up to the last portion, and that is in verse 18 throughout the remainder of this chapter, which is about half the chapter. I have that titled, Abner kills Asahel and sparks a slaughter, and that is how you pronounce his name. So one thing that we see here in verse number 18 is that it says, and there were three sons of Zerahiah. That's how you say it. Zerahiah there. Zerahiah is David's sister. Okay. So that's Joab and Abishai and Asahel. They are David's nephews. They're brothers, the sons of Zerahiah. And it says that Asahel was light of foot as a wild roe, and so he's very fast. And he begins chasing after Abner. And Abner looks back. You can see Abner's in full flight, and he's looking back. And this boy's just going after him. He says, man, go get somebody else. And he's just chasing after him. And Abner says, God, get that guy. Get the spoils of war, that dead guy over there. And Asahel's just chasing him. And finally, Abner's like, all right. And he stops and he gets him with a spear. And Asahel runs into it, strikes him under the fifth rib. And that's an important thing to note. You're going to see under the fifth rib several times moving forward. Asahel gets stabbed under the fifth rib. Joab and Abishai, and they come along and they see that their brother's slain. And boy, it's on. And they're chasing after Abner. And Abner and a bunch of Benjamites, they get up. They get up to the hill of Ammah. They're in verse number 24. And they're at the top of a hill. And Abner's calling for a truce. He's like, man, hold on. This is never going to end. We need to stop this. We're brothers type deal. And And Joab calls off the fight and goes back and gets his brother's body and goes to bury him. Now, we can see that David and his men are battle-hardened warriors. Not so much for Ishbosheth's men, because in the whole fight, only 19 men and Asahel of David's died, so 20 men. But David killed of Abner's men 360. I mean, it was a slaughter. So, like I said, the majority of this chapter deals with this great battle between Joab and Abner and the things that took place there. So that's going to be 2 Samuel chapter 2. We see the coronation of the king, at least in part. He was there in Hebron for 7.5 years. And that's another detail I'm going to give you here. Let me turn back over. When we see these time frames here, that Ishbosheth in verse number 10, he reigned for 2 years, but David was in Hebron for 7 years and 6 months, so he was there 7.5 years, but Ishbosheth only reigned for 2 years. So what had happened was, by the time David was anointed king in Hebron, the other tribes, Abner was going around saying, hey, you need to get behind Ishbosheth. And it took him 5 years, essentially, to do it, because Ishbosheth's reign is only 2 years, and then you're going to see what happens to him here shortly. And David had been king for 5 years at that time. So that's going to be 2 Samuel chapter 2. I hope this has been some sort of help to you. God bless you, and we'll see you tomorrow.